Morning Glory, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. While much of America's business and political elite is in Davos, we're right here on MSNBC. Following developments in the Russia probe and the exploding FBI and DOJ controversies, even as we keep our collective eyes on the goings-on across the Atlantic. After the week opened with the collapse of the Schumer shutdown, which was a huge win for Trump and Mitch McConnell, and a great shock to the Democratic base about the lack of resolve among their Senate leadership, the news quickly turned to the continuing eruption of economic good news for workers and companies across the United States, as well as the surprising emergence of the outline of a deal on DACA, border security, and defense spending. After the break, perhaps before it, we will focus on what may very well explode into the biggest story of the year next week, an escalating confrontation with Turkey, our NATO ally, in a conversation with the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, Admiral James Stavridis. But first, a few minutes with the trio of DC's best reporters on the story they found to be the biggest of the week. I'm joined by NBC's own national security and Pentagon correspondent, Courtney Kube, the Daily Beast's Lachlan Markay, and for the first time, the Atlantic's Elaina Plott. Welcome all. Courtney, since I'm going to spend the second half of the show focused abroad, I think I'll start with Lachlan. You and I will get back to Turkey, I think. Lachlan, what do you think of the president's performance in Davos?
Well, I thought the reaction to the president was as interesting as what the president had to say. And you saw a lot of, these global elites who are actually warming to President Trump to a degree, especially folks in the sort of business-oriented contingent in Davos. And I think they're warming to him to the degree that he's acting more like a generic Republican. Obviously, the stock market's booming, but tax reform was a huge win. And I think it shows the degree to which, Trump's success is sort of divorced from the Trump show, so to speak. There's sort of a duality to this administration. There's the policies coming out of the White House, which to a large degree are policies you'd see from really any Republican president. And then there's sort of the spectacle of the tweets and the personal attacks. And I think folks in Davos are realizing that even if they don't like that latter part, the Trump show, the Trump presidency is definitely something that they can live with.
Lachlan, his best speeches have come abroad. In Saudi Arabia, to the combined leaders of Islam. In Poland, West his best speech, and now a great speech in Davos. Jonathan, NBC said his best yet. Do you see any reason why that would be the case? He's better abroad than he is at home?
Well, I think he sticks more to the teleprompter when it comes to foreign policy. Certainly, you saw, for instance, just to illustrate this point, the Heritage Foundation said this week that they had 334 policy initiatives that they were hoping the new administration would enact heading into 2017. Two-thirds of those the Trump administration has already enacted. So to the degree that Trump sort of hews to maybe a more predefined narrative or policy focus, one that's crafted by actual experts in the fields that he's working in, I think he sees more success there rather than when he flies off the handle on issues that are more sort of near and dear to his heart, things like trade and immigration. That tends to turn off folks like the Davos crowd, folks like the Republican establishment, and I think to a large degree voters in the U.S. in general.
He's certainly surprised on immigration this week, and I'll go to Elaina Plott on this. Elaina, welcome. Great to have you on for the first time from the Atlantic. What's your big story of the week? I think it's about immigration.
Absolutely. So the White House threw a bit of a curveball last night when Stephen Miller, on a call with Republican lawmakers on the Hill, said that the White House was proposing a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients and other so-called dreamers who would be eligible for DACA status, 1.8 million of them. I'm already hearing from the House Freedom Caucus senior aides there that this is breaking the promise of no amnesty that Trump kind of carried with him along the campaign trail. But Hugh, I think the big story here is that you have hardline conservatives such as Senators Tom Cotton and David Perdue really rallying behind the White House with this proposal. So I think it's going to be interesting to see. I've covered the Hill for a few years now, and I haven't seen a moment where the House Freedom Caucus and then conservatives like Senator Mike Lee, Cotton and Perdue are not aligned. So it'll be interesting to see what the House ultimately does if this bill does in fact go through the Senate.
Elaina, I think it's going to get through the Senate. I've been arguing for this kind of a package since 2006. Border security plus allowing the dreamers to stay. They got to stay, plus a number of other minor changes in the immigration law. So I think it gets through the Senate. It goes to the House. But at that point, won't Democrats have to vote for it? How would they not give a path to citizenship to 1.8 million people in the country?
Here's what I'm hearing from House Democrats. One senior aide described this proposal to me as a bit of a Trojan horse, right? So, yes, a pathway to citizenship for 1.8 million DACA recipients. But you're also, with this proposal, agreeing to a $25 billion trust when it comes to implementing Donald Trump's wall along the Mexican border. So I do think you could see House Democrats, perhaps not the likes of Chuck Schumer and his caucus, but once we get to the lower chamber, you're going to have people saying that this is just a front for something that could ultimately be far more damaging to the immigration system in this country. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if you had a huge swath of House Democrats take a stand against the proposal.
I will be shocked if they look 1.8 million people in the eye and say, no, you can't stay. We're turning you away at this moment of opportunity. Courtney, you and I might be focused on the same thing this week. What's your big story of the week?
Well, it's what has the potential to be an explosive situation in northern Syria and northwestern Syria, Hugh. You said it yourself. This could end up being a huge story. About a week ago, Turkish forces began airstrikes. They began an extensive ground operation in northwestern Syria in an area called the Afrin Gap, or the Afrin Pocket. It's inhabited by Afrin Kurds, who they're closely aligned with the YPG, who are the Syrian Kurds that the U.S. has to go after ISIS. So why this matters? The U.S. actually has not been backing this Kurdish group, but as I said, the YPG is. They're the ones, they've been the strongest fighters, the strongest ally that the U.S. has in the fight against ISIS, and now these YPG are starting to turn their attention up towards Afrin. So the U.S. forces that are down now towards the Manbij area, the concern is that as Turkey moves into Afrin, as they're fighting their way in Afrin, killing civilians, that they may start moving further towards Manbij, where there are U.S. forces. And then what happens? Does the U.S. enter in some sort of a confrontation, a military confrontation with a strong U.S. ally, Turkey, or what happens? Right now, we just don't know. The other concern, of course, is that there still is an ISIS presence in the Euphrates River Valley over closer towards the eastern side of the country, and this is just going to take attention away from that fight.
You know, Courtney, we've got 12,000 American troops in northern Syria. Not many people know that. What are the people at the Pentagon telling you about how they grade the likelihood of an actual NATO-on-NATO clash? That would be, I think, the first ever in the history of the alliance. I'll ask the Admiral after the break about that. But what do they say at the Pentagon to you about that, the likelihood of that?
So people at the Pentagon are still convinced that the U.S. and Turkish military ties are strong enough that they'll be able to avoid that, but they're watching it very closely. There is a lot of concern right now in the Pentagon about what's going to happen. They're watching closely to see if the Turkish forces actually move towards Manbij, or if they're in any way the U.S. is able to convince them to stay up in the more northwestern side of the country, away from where U.S. and YPG forces are. And you have to look at this from Turkey's side. This isn't the first time that they have gone across the border into Syria. They see the YPG, they see the Kurds as a terrorist force, as terrorists who have inside their country. And the Turks are very angry at the United States for continuing to support these Kurds. From the U.S. perspective, from the coalition perspective, the YPG, the Kurds, have been the strongest fighters on the ground. You could give them a lot of the credit for the fact that ISIS really has been all but decimated in Syria. There still are ISIS fighters, of course, but they've lost their caliphate. They've really lost their ground and their stronghold. And that is due in large part to this YPG force.
They're incredible allies. I want to get a quick reaction from Lachlan and Elaina on whether or not they're even following this story. Lachlan, has this been on your radar?
It has, but I wish I could say I was an expert. What I've been focusing more on is the domestic lobbying operation that Turkey has really beefed up in the United States over the last couple of years. And I think that's something to really keep an eye on, is the degree to which, experienced politicos and hands from past administrations are trying to sort of press that government's interests in the nation's capital. So that's something I'm going to keep an eye on.
Elaina, have you seen that as well in your congressional reporting?
The problem right now, Hugh, is that you know, even as recently as this morning, when I'm talking to members and chiefs of staff of members, what they focus on is the news of the day. So right now, it's you know, the New York Times report that Donald Trump insisted to his lawyer Don McGahn that he fire Bob Mueller. So I do think these issues, what you think is the big story of the day, gets lost in kind of the scrum of daily news that these aides have to kind of comment